Hello again. In this video, we're going to look at some specific child development theories and programmatic responses that have been undertaken across the world in response to theoretical development. In this video, we're going to look first at brain formation and cellular growth within a child's mind, just briefly, and then a look at epigenetics, which is an extension of theory on the cellular growth and development of the brain. After that, we're looking at childhood experiences and exposures and some of the programmatic and structural responses to the research that's been undertaken. Following on from this, some of the challenges that have been encountered to child development responses locally and globally. Then we're going to look at how to utilize theoretical frameworks and, in a sense, how to deconstruct them a bit in order to be able to apply them with more control within your local context. And finally, a case study on an adaptive use of theory in a complex service environment, just really to highlight the limits of theory and the importance of being able to combine theory and local contextual knowledge in responding to highly complex needs. So firstly, we're having a look at brain formation in a child's mind. There are quite a number of graphics available to describe this. I like the one presented here because it shows the various levels of development in a simplified form for a human mind across the main period of neuron development in the brain. And you can see that most of the activities in the early years, or actually prenatal to the early years of life. So the sensory system, the limbic system, which is the basis for emotions, and the language systems are all fairly much past their peak by the end of early childhood. Epigenetics is a field of biology which is aiming to build a basis for the effects of various exposures on the human body and mind. Environmental exposures and experiences can influence the behavior of our genes, and there could be corresponding positive or negative effects on health and development. Some of the areas in which this has been undertaken include nutrition, multivitamin consumption, the effect of nurturing stimuli for infants and young children, the effects of trauma, and prolonged periods of stress. The basic thrust of this research is that certain exposures promote a healthy gene expression and healthy development. Other exposures which are less positive can affect gene expression in a damaging way. There are some speculations about an intergenerational impact of epigenetics, which I don't believe is yet fully proven for humans or mammals. It seems to have been proven scientifically for simpler life forms like fungi, but for mammals, I think the jury is still out on that one. Childhood experiences and exposures. It might be common sense to say this, but science takes a bit longer to get to the same conclusion. That early childhood experiences and exposures have a lasting effect on social, educational, economic and health status for individuals. And so this relates to basically every domain of human experience. So the stability, the reliability of relationships, the level of safety, the amount of nurturing and attention that's given, the quality of education and educational exposures during early childhood, the amount of learning in the home environment, structured or unstructured, abuse, neglect or trauma, if that's present. I would also put in there the quality of opportunities for play. And what's been found in some of the studies on childhood experiences and exposures is that early childhood development practices, when put into place across communities, has a strong effect on equalising structural disadvantages between different cohorts of the community. So some programmatic and structural responses, it's been very diverse. There hasn't really been a universal trend in any particular area here. So nations tend to take an approach that matches their cultural predispositions or their structural formats in which to organise these activities. So early child development programs have arisen in a lot of Western nations and in some other nations. Australia has developed the Early Development Census, which was born out of the Canadian Early Development Index. There's interesting stories coming out of Cuba of the integration of their maternal health programs and their early childhood programs. Cuba actually has a very high literacy rate and a very high a very low infant mortality rate. So there seem to be some good integrated efforts going on there. But being Cuba, it's somewhat hard to get as much information about what's going on there as you can get from some other nations. Norway and Sweden have an emphasis on local municipal control of childhood development programming, which is quite interesting. It can lead to some diversity of approaches and local responsiveness. And cost-benefit analysis is probably the United States' main contribution to this space in terms of describing the heightened the heightened economic advantage of early childhood programming in relation to interventions at later stages of development. So Jim Heckman is a leading figure in this. He's produced some very well-known studies and some figures which highlight the economic benefits of programming in the early childhood space. There are, however, a lot of challenges to delivering child development responses. Measurement and validity is a very difficult area, and we've talked about that in the previous video. It is quite hard to come up with consistent or reliable ways to measure child development due to the complexity, due to the fact that it's highly variable for each individual and within each context. This is quite difficult in terms of having funding bodies and governments who are really seeking verifiable ways of investing their money in services of this nature. Child development involves a lot of different fields which have become over time fairly segregated from each other. So interdisciplinary communication being limited affects the ability to respond to child development in a holistic fashion. Then there are, in real terms, limitations to the benefits of child development programs which need to be acknowledged. So children's connections with their caregivers is decisive. The ability to integrate child development actions and responses with the home environment is critically important as well. And I've borrowed here the phrase, the other 23 hours, from the 3 Pillars framework, which essentially talks about, sure, you've got your 1 hour of intervention with families, but then what happens when that family goes home? Does any of the practice, does any of the learning go home with them? Parental engagement and parental focus on the needs of children is critically important. This is found in practice in really any service that works intensively with families. And then the matters of accessibility of services, the affordability, the universality, do they reach everyone? Is the quality consistent? Beyond all of this, then in some nations, including Australia, there are particular social and cultural perspectives which don't necessarily help. And these can have a bearing on the accessibility of services and the universality of services. Some local frameworks. In Australia, we have the Australian Early Development Census and the Early Years Learning Framework. So there are links here to those resources if you're not familiar with them. Another local framework developed by the University of South Australia by Professor John Lynch and his colleagues is the 5x5 model, which I haven't seen in practice very broadly, but it's quite interesting in terms of delineating 5 developmental dimensions similar to the AEDC, but also looking at 5 developmental stages for each of these, from pregnancy through to early childhood. So the Australian Early Development Census and 5x5 and other frameworks of this nature typically name a small number of domains of development that they choose to work with. And this is done for a number of reasons. Having a small number means it's fairly easy to communicate and fairly easy to undertake practices to obtain data for these frameworks. But really, as with any framework, it's quite arbitrary how you define and classify these domains. I found through looking at the Australian Early Development Census and relating it to some of the support materials that state governments were coming out with, particularly there were some fairly useful resources from the Queensland state government, but it was quite possible to break down those 5 main domains into a lot of subdomains or modalities, if you like, of experience. I've listed about 20 here. This is arbitrary. This is just what came up when I first looked at it. You could go into more detail. You could come up with 30 or 40 or 50. There are aspects here that need to be unpacked and explored a lot more. For instance, the domain there of kinship consciousness. It's there specifically in relation to Aboriginal children and Aboriginal communities. But that phrase, kinship consciousness, is quite a clunky one, I believe. It's all that I could come up with from my Western perspective. But I'm sure putting this concept in the hands of Aboriginal families, it will be articulated much better and be able to inform an approach to child development much better. However, kinship consciousness of any nature isn't really explicit in our main frameworks that are used for child development in Australia. So when we also look at the frameworks, the Early Development Census in Australia looks at conditions of well-being, and you can group these into some main headings such as relationships, physical and material needs, access to developmental resources and experiences, autonomy and agency. So if we go back to the first one there, relationships obviously are fairly central. A loving and present primary caregiver, nurturing supportive relationships, safe and respectful relationships with peers, and then support, exposure to settings and so forth. Physical and material needs are reasonably straightforward. Conditions of well-being. So this is really access to developmental resources and experiences which may be available in the family home, may need to be looking at community level resources for this. And then finally, autonomy and agency, opportunities to play, involvement in learning and new experiences by children. Again, these are fairly arbitrary designations. It would be possible to work with these and come up with something fairly customized to any particular environment or any particular evaluation framework. The point in doing all of this is that all of these definitions, domains, and conditions, they're arbitrary. We classify human experience and behaviours and responses into a certain number of groupings so that we're able to communicate it, understand it, and to work with complexity. So we need to stay mindful of that. We create these systems to help us, but then the systems impose themselves on our work with real people. Frameworks also respond to a certain set of social and cultural assumptions. So again, looking at the Australian Early Development Census, it is not developed from an Aboriginal perspective. That's been a fairly consistent criticism of it. It's been set up and it's running. It cannot change its basic structure without now compromising the integrity of its statistical aspects. But in order to then work functionally well with Aboriginal children, we need to look at something beyond the Australian Early Development Census. If we're going to work with children who've experienced trauma, abuse or neglect, we need to have special focus on areas of development specific to the experiences that those children have had. And the same applies for children with a disability, children from new arrival backgrounds, from culturally diverse and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We need to be able to take existing frameworks and emphasise the elements that we need to emphasise for our local context. We also need to work with the family and the community, not just with the child. We need to retain the ecological approach. Most of the frameworks we see are very centred on the behaviour and the performance of children without necessarily looking in depth at the family and community environments surrounding and influencing the child. Finally, I want to use an example of a service which has extended its practice beyond the available theory by, over a period of time, actively listening to and responding to families with complex needs. This is the Family Zone operated by Lutheran Community Care in Northern Adelaide. You may not be able to see all of the detail in this slide, depending on how you're viewing it, but it's perhaps enough to be able to see the structure of this, and particularly to see the range of linkages between activities and outputs and the outcomes. It's intentionally been developed to look as complex as this because it is this complex. And there are a lot of factors that feed into the various outcomes that occur. This service has developed really through a complex mix of theoretical understandings, specialist trainings, and long-term relationship with families. And it's developed a model which continues to grow with virtually with every family that comes into contact with the service. I get the sense that this kind of service and this kind of model is about as close to reality as we can get with any kind of theoretical approach to child development or in family well-being as an environmental basis for child development. So some further resources for further exploration. There's a wealth of resources online. You can spend a lot of time looking this stuff up. I certainly have. The Australian Early Development Census and the Early Years Learning Framework are great places to start for the Australian context. It's useful to look at the Canadian Early Development Index as well, and to explore other international approaches to child development. So we have in the UK, Leeds is a municipal area that has a very interesting approach through, what's it called? I can't remember the name of the initiative, but definitely look up Leeds and Child-Friendly Cities, I think it is. In the United States, Promised Neighborhoods is a great example. And then see what you can find on Cuba, on Scandinavia and the Netherlands, and other nations of interest. Then in terms of adaptive local service responses in Australia, have a look at what the Family Zone does. It's also interesting to note there's other services in South Australia and nationally that have developed a very similar model of approach in isolation from each other. So I've listed a couple here. The Fleurieu Family Service in the Fleurieu region of SA, and Capital Region Community Service based in the ACT.